Will you welcome the man who's that magnificent writer, a great dramatist. It's Mr. Truman Capote, Mr. Tennessee Williams.
The great accomplishment of In Cold Blood is that I never appear once. I wanted to write a book that would read exactly as though it were a novel, except that every word of it would be absolutely true.
I think the only thing I've done that is an autobiographical work was The Glass Menagerie.
It was the first hit that I had.
I really think you've written a masterpiece here.
Thank you.
How did I write? We all have a great desire to escape from ourselves.
People are always saying, are you happy? I think it's the most idiotic question I know. I mean, nobody is happy.
You're very frank about your homosexuality in the memoirs.
I was aware, of course, for a long time before it ever surfaced.
I just felt things would be easier if I were a girl.
I've known Tennessee a long time. Our friendship has had its ups and downs. Here is a man who has devoted his whole life to art and is a genius.
Why do writers fall in and out of friendship with each other?
Well, jealousy, don't you think?
Most people think because somebody is a creative individual, they must be intelligent. It is not so, like Tennessee Williams.
Capote's a liar, and everyone knows he is.
It really was a sort of intellectual friendship, though people inevitably thought otherwise.
Now, I don't care what anybody says about me as long as it isn't true.
I'm talking too intimately to you. Let's get on to something more general.
But if friendship leads to love, does it normally lead to sex too?
No. Friendship lead to sex?
Love the film. It's right up my alley. I do literary publicity for living authors.
Oh, good.
But anyway, of course, from my childhood, I grew up with Truman Capote and Tennessee Williams. Mm-hmm. They were, your documentary, which we'll say is called Truman and Tennessee, an intimate conversation. And, the crux of it takes place in my early childhood, but I remember it's just growing, they were all over the place, and they were always on the talk shows, and they were always in the, magazines. And, whenever a book or a play came out or a film, it was a big deal. Yeah. They were iconic, and so it's kind of like was it intimidating for you to try to take on such a subject?
You always asked me that question. Very good question. Thank you for asking that. And you know what? Yes, I guess it was intimidating in a way, because I knew from the very beginning that I wanted to use their words to tell a story. And so I was not relying on, often with my other characters, I've had a lot of other assets, in the sense that I've had artwork, I've had magazines, I've had photography. And of course, I had some of those assets, but it was about creating the whole narrative arc with these words, which were important literary words. And this was, this is not as much my world. And, right. But it was really, I guess that the other part of this was the fact that I was really pushing myself creatively, because there are no talking heads. I did not want talking heads for the purpose that I do not feel that anybody contemporary needed to weigh in on their legacy, on their writing. I really wanted to tell it from the point of view of their words themselves. So that's, I wanted to, it's always the idea of trying to give it justice 100%. Right. And I think that that's something that, is in my work, that I'm always trying to allow these characters to be alive themselves. And I think that, ultimately, this did give us, I do feel that both Truman and Tennessee are alive. I mean, of course, they've been voiced by Jim Parsons and Zach Quinto, which is, brings it just to a completely different level. But the fact is they're voicing their real words, and that's what's so nice.
There's so much, right? There's so much available to you, or enough, sufficient anyway, for you to not need those talking heads that you were talking about. And just to explain again, like you use firsthand footage, archival footage of both Truman Capote and Tennessee Williams from talk shows or appearances, what have you. And then because there's so much also written word, you cast Jim Parsons and Zachary Quinto in the roles of Truman and Tennessee, respectively. Correct? That's
yes, exactly.
It was a great choice, and they kind of both, especially I guess Jim, just sort of, almost does the impression thing. He sort of inserts there. I could hear it a little bit. The Truman Capote. It's that, and which kind of that persona of his really only, the real Truman grew as he aged. It seems like this kind of caricature he created, which let me ask you, engage you about this next part, which is, to me, that almost seems like what you're getting at when I've read some of your notes about Truman, who was more defensive, perhaps. Like, it would make sense that he might build the persona side to protect himself, whereas Tennessee, I mean, all that footage, like on the David Frost interviews, so raw, so stripped down. Is that your impression? What's your impression?
No, I think you totally got it, because I do feel that there is a caricature that Truman had invented of himself, and there's this persona that has been crafted from a very young age. And I think of the times when he talks about when he got to New York and he was an intern at the New Yorker, and what he was doing, but it was a narrative that he was very right on about. And the fact is that there is a rawness, there's a sincerity to Tennessee Williams, which really struck me. And I only knew him through his work and through his movies, and mostly through his movies. So I'm not the percentage of people who watched the movies and knew the movie more than the actual work. And then when I got to know Tennessee Williams through his writing, the biographies, and there've been some brilliant biographies, there's this man with a sensitivity and an honesty, and not willing to cover it up. And in his journals, he had crippling shyness, just crippling shyness, and from a young age. And the fact is, what you were seeing on the stage and all of his works was really him coming out. There were, he said the Glass Menagerie was only autobiographical work. I don't think it's true. But I mean,
Laura, the character of Laura was essentially an extension of some aspect of who he.
Sure. I mean, but I think in every one of his works, there was something autobiographical. But there was, and it was a challenge for us, because I edited this film with Bernadine Kolish, who did my last two films, Peggy Guggenheim, Art Addict, and Love Cecil on Cecil Beaton. And, she just never gives up on the narrative. Like, she'll come in the next morning and just kind of hack away. And she's like, we can do this a little bit better. And the fact that we chose not to do a biopic on them gave us this freedom to be able to kind of go in and out of these interviews and use the interviews as a launch pad to go off on discussions. But what we wanted to do was to couple it, because, we had the opportunity with the two characters to be able to say, okay, let's talk about their writing, the difficulty with writing.
Right, or relation.
Their homosexuality, their whatever it can be, the fact they lived in Europe, their lovers, their addictions. And it gave, for me, creatively, it gave me such freedom to be able to just kind of feel like, okay, well, now we don't have to deal with this, like the basic things that you have to do when you're actually doing a biopic, and I personally really enjoyed that.
Well, you went into it, right? Just you were intending to just make a film about Truman Capote, but it ended up being this conversation, this intimate conversation, as it were, which I think really, I thought it was very effective, actually. It's funny, you mentioned that you were familiar with Tennessee's films, and I found I had this when Tennessee talked about how diluted the film versions of his work became, that you didn't really know what they were essentially really about, the stories, because they made it either so cryptic or just removed it altogether in the process of making the adaptation. And the same could be said of course, Breakfast at Tiffany's, Truman's story, because Holly Golightly comes off very differently in the film version, as does, of course, I forget what the character's, George Peppard's character, but
Well, they do, and if you think of, going back, well, let's stick with Breakfast at Tiffany's, because if, since Truman did want to have Marilyn Monroe cast, it would have been a very different feeling of having Marilyn Monroe than Audrey Hepburn, because there's, the whole call girl concept would have been a lot stronger if it was delivered by Marilyn Monroe. But with Audrey Hepburn, there's a certain innocence. And, in the adaptations of Tennessee Williams plays into movies, there was a change. There was what was going on in Hollywood. There was a certain censorship. He was dealing with topics like rape, homosexuality, insanity, things that people did not talk about. And so Hollywood was not ready to have a taste of all of that. And so these endings were altered.
Yeah. Don't forget my personal favorite, Cannibalism.
Of course. Well, it is an in subject depending on what current actors are into cannibalism or not, or we don't have to mention names.
What you said towards the beginning, and I meant to ask you about it, was that, I mean, you've made films documentaries about fashion or, right, and art. An art. So, and one could sort of draw some distinctions about, or comment, similarities. And then this was a brand new, very different palette or part of the palette, let's say. And I'm just wondering what tipped you into that? What motivated you? Just stepping outside your comfort zone? Was that it? Or?
I think, for me, they all deal with, there's certain topics that all of my films deal with. And I guess I didn't do it purposely. It just comes out because it's something I guess I question. So I think there's always the creative process that I question in my characters and what it does to them, how it drives them, but then how it drives them in both ways. It can, omit kind of part of their life because it's a sacrifice that has to happen. So I think there's that part. Right. And then I think I like the idea of people reinventing themselves. And in a case of, I don't think that Tennessee did. I think that Truman certainly. There was a clear, there's an intentional act on his part to reinvent himself from a young age. And then I also feel, so I think that those are things that are always there. Those are aspects that are important and qualities that are important in my work. Creatively, it was just being able to do it this way and not have talking heads was something I wanted to do from the start. And of course, it did end up becoming a Truman in Tennessee because there was another film in the works, another Truman Capote. And I knew they were going to get it done. It's the Capote tapes, and I'm sure it's a great film, but and I knew it was going to be different anyway. I knew because we all tell stories in different ways. But Mark Lee, who was producer, and he's been involved in several of my films, he said, let's put Tennessee in there. And it's just, and that's what's so great about having a team and having a team who can come in and give you ideas and work together. It's all about collaboration.
What else here? Let's see, I wrote down here, LGBT, alcohol. Alcohol. plays a part. Addiction plays a part in both these guys. It seems like Tennessee perhaps was more honest and open about his issue.
I think they were both children of alcoholics. So in Truman's case, it was his mother, and that's really what she died from ultimately. And in Tennessee's case, it was his father. Mm-hmm. And so I think that this was another thing that as a team, we didn't want to shy away from the story. And also, back then people weren't really dealing with it. They weren't talking about it. They could just, back then it could just have been a heavy cocktail hour, but that was in fact addiction. And they didn't escape from it. And I think that, as they both went through their own professional struggles, this was an important part of, unfortunately, of their life. And it played such a dominant role. The one thing I think to note between the two of them is that, because I also want to kind of reestablish their legacies for younger generations when I make this film. And what we see of Truman and Tennessee, if you go onto YouTube, you don't see them in the way that they look in the film, that they're kind of full of life and inspirational. You see these kind of broken down videos sometimes of them, and them stumbling, and that's not. These are the two most important American writers of the 20th century, and we need to celebrate them. We need to admire what they actually accomplished as writers. I mean, it's their word. We are still thinking about their words. People are still inspired by them, and that's why it's nice to be able to do a film like this. But at the same time, we do have to tell these stories. And today we talk about addiction. We can deal with addiction. It's completely taken on different. Back then, it wasn't like that, and that's why we shy away from it.
Yeah, they didn't shy, and it's interesting because drinking was much more
social.
So there was less of a stigma on one hand. On the other hand, admitting that you were out of control was a stigma.
It was, and of course, they had. I think Truman went several times to centers. I can't remember where he went, but it didn't work.
Right.
It just absolutely never worked. And, and I really feel that he stopped writing at a certain point. I mean, it seemed like things really started to fall apart for him after In Cold Blood. I mean, he did write answered prayers. I mean, I do not think it's hidden away in a locker somewhere in Grand Central Station or wherever, conspiracy theories place it. But, Tennessee continued to write. He always did, even if it was whatever it was not, it wasn't Pulitzer Prize material.
Right.
But he did continue, and that's important, and that's another aspect of Tennessee Williams that I admire, because he was always so obsessed with this need to write. While with Truman, it really did fall apart.
Yeah. You mentioned they were two the most. I might stick James Baldwin in there too.
I think you can, definitely. No, I think there are others. I think definitely James Baldwin.
And I just mentioned him in particular because I think also could have even expanded to three of these guys in a way. There's also James Baldwin, a lot of European time, not just because of his being gay, but also his being African American. But the gay side of it also, I found that these David Frost interviews were just really almost shocking to see how unfiltered
he was. Everybody was.
What was going on there? I mean, were those Frost in Hollywood by then? This was probably after. Was this after the?
I think it was. I do think it was, and I need to discover them more. It's just that, I worked with this. I've never worked with David Frost interviews, but I certainly want to again, because there was this intimacy, and because he was, I think they sound that way because it all comes from him.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm a huge fan of Dick Cavett. I've used Dick Cavett interviews often.
Yeah.
It's interesting because Dick Cavett, who's been, you know, punched, I mean, the things that have happened to him in interviews, and he's so solid and such an educated man, and he just and smart about things, and he's always he's like a punching bag because he reacts to anybody who's been on his stage before, but he's always kind of very straight up and very proper. David Frost, still very proper, but in there, touching.
Oh yeah.
Leaning toward people and kind of creating this more intimate setting for them and helping them just open up, I think, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. And I think he's a definite third kind of character in the film. And I feel like it would make sense it would be after the Nixon interviews, because most people don't know just how famous he became from that. And he could do a show like that, which I don't think he could have done a show like that, so intimate. You know, he was bordering a little bit on maybe being I mean, I don't want to say tabloid, but you know what I'm saying? Like like he was trying to obviously bring up things that would be racy and controversial just for that, but it seemed he was genuinely interested in getting these guys to open up about their lives so we could understand them better as artists and human beings, and he got as close as anybody probably ever did.
Oh, I think so. At least in the body of interviews that we had on Tennessee, I think that these certainly were the most intimate. I mean, I have to say that Tennessee did open up, but there's also something about the visual of these interviews because, you know, Tennessee's in this kind of navy blue, like skinny flat front pants, goes in, and the set, David Frost's set also looked so cool. And you know, it was like the best looking set. and there was something kind of like slinky about Tennessee. And I think that the slinkiness also is due to the fact that perhaps, I mean, he always seems to have a glass of white wine.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, maybe something else. You know, he always does that thing with his tongue, the rolling around with the tongue, and but also, you know, Tennessee was much more of a sexual person, and you can definitely get that just by because he has a sexiness to his character. While and in my research, I mean, it's quite clear he was also a sex addict. So he was not only, but he was clearly a sex addict. And he talks about it. He doesn't talk about it as being an addict, but he talks about his sexual need and desires continually being addressed. He would go down to Times Square. I mean, the sailors would come in with the boat. He would go down, cruise Times Square, come back, go in the morning, come back for more in the afternoon, and did not hide away from that.
Right. While
with Truman, you always felt that he was a little bit, you know, he definitely had relationships. Jack Dunphy was important, but it was not like his relationships, the social relationships seemed to be much more important.
Right, and there's that photo, of course, the famous Truman photo, which was certainly some awareness of his sexuality back then, and so it did exist. And I think over time, you know, came this need or you know, some sort of need to just kind of create that persona I was kind of referring to and hide a little bit more and more as time, so including his sexuality perhaps, part of who he was. There's so much more. I mean, we didn't get to the number of things, but I want to just urge everybody, Truman and Tennessee, an Intimate Conversation is going to open or premiere virtually and theatrically.
Yes, because theaters are opening. Go to theaters, everybody.
On June 18th, which I think is that Friday?
Friday. It's playing the Film Forum in New York.
I know, Film Forum, our favorite art house.
Yes.
It's a perfect partnership there, or marriage. The Film Forum is terrific. It's just the right place for it. So people should go down and check it out. It was really great to meet you and talk to you about your film. Let's do it again with your next work. And one suggestion could be, I'm envisioning a David Frost documentary. That's what was occurring to me as I was talking about him, and what a fascinating figure he cut. And then also, it could be, if we're going to go back to this intimate conversation structure that you've all but created, we could do a Cavett versus Frost, because they're contemporary.
We could have them face off with different characters. Okay, so let's stop talking. We have a film in the making.
All righty. I'm going to do it direct.
Thank you very, very, very much. Okay. Thanks for including me.
Much luck with the film.